Hello and welcome to another edition of the Florida Writer Podcast. I'm your host, Allison Nissen. Today I am lucky enough to have with me, back with me, Melody Dean Dimick. Melody, why don't you give us a 60-second elevator pitch about who you are and what you write?
As you said, I'm Melody Dean Dimick, melody like a song, and I write young adult poetry and young adult novels, but I'm going to break out next year and write some work for adults. I'm the president of the Florida Writers Foundation. I took that job on because I want to promote literacy. I think that if you can't read, then you can't function in this modern world. Our prisons are full in part because many people can't get a job and hold it because they can't read. We have over 30% of the population in the state of Florida are people who cannot read. We can't have that. So I hope that my young adult stories will catch the interest of teenagers and they'll want to read.
30% of the people in the state of Florida cannot read?
Right.
Cannot write.
They cannot read. Correct.
Correct.
And I was doing research. I'm trying to write a flyer for the Florida Writers Foundation, and I spoke to someone in Volusia County who is on the Literacy Council, and he said so many people are unemployed because they get a job and the boss says, take this pamphlet home and read it and come back and do a presentation on it tomorrow for the whole group. They never return to work because they don't want to say, I couldn't read it. And so it contributes to people having this record of not holding a job. And also, many of the prisoners who return are people who cannot read.
There's a lot of shame associated with not being able to read.
Correct. There was a book written a few years ago called The Reader, and she couldn't read and she didn't want to tell anybody. And it resulted in her whole life being ruined, destroyed. She lost the love of her life because she wouldn't admit to not being able to read.
So you have written several books.
Yes, I have.
And you have written several books that are in the form of poetry. Is that correct?
Yes, I write novels in verse.
Why don't you tell us what that means?
A novel in verse is simply a collection of poems that tell a story, but the novel in verse isn't really about the poetry as much as the story. So there's still a character arc. We tell the story of a person through poetry. And the reason that it is so popular with teenagers is because teenagers really love poetry. It gets to the heart and to the emotions. I write from the first person, and teenagers relate to that first person I. A librarian told me that novels in verse are like potato chips. You can't eat just one. Once a teenager reads one, he or she is looking for another novel in verse. They're quick reads. It's a lot easier to read a poem on a page than it is to read a long page of prose.
I have two questions. One, I imagine that it's easier to read the poem because there's a lot more white space.
Yes.
So the white space allows your brain to process easier. So when there's all those words and there's no spacing, you get overwhelmed.
Exactly.
And then the story in verse, or the novel in verse, you said it's several poems. So it's not an epic poem?
Not an epic poem at all. It's not like the Rime of the Ancient Mariner. What it is like Crank by Ellen Hopkins. I don't know if you've ever heard of that. It's usually in the first person, and often it's a story where a teenager is dealing with a problem, such as substance abuse, cutting. In my example, my student is dealing with the father who has post-traumatic stress syndrome, and they live in a house or trailer really, that is surrounded by a chain link fence, and so she feels isolated from the rest of the world and worries when her father might go off the deep end. There are guns all over the house.
Now, you said you want to switch gears and start writing for adults. Will that also be with poetry? Or will that be...
I'm trying to write, and I know it's something that it's going to be difficult to find a publisher for, so I may have to self-publish it. I'm trying to write a book that has some poetry and has a short story and maybe a short play. Everything is going to be connected by a theme. The poem that I submitted for the collection has been included in the collection is the poem that I'm working with as the title poem. Also, the poem that is a finalist for the Royal Palm Literary Award this year is a longer version of the poem that I'm playing with. I don't write poems that take more than 2 pages, however. They have to be facing each other. I like my poems to be all on 1 or 2 pages, but facing each other.
I think I'm going to have to try to write my own novel in verse, because you've made this really sound very intriguing to me. And the way you're describing the poem with just 2 pages, and then I realize you're talking about something else right now with your adult version of a poem with a play and a short story. And yet I can see where the poems are attractive and why you would be drawn to those. Tell me about the settings of your poems and or stories.
Right. Well, the one that I've been working on is set in a school. I have spent 34 years teaching in a high school, and I spent 24 years teaching at the State University of New York at Plattsburgh. So schools are the basis of where I write my settings. And also, schools are where many people get their scars. My theme is that many people never escape high school. And so that is a theme that runs throughout my work, that there are scars that we just can't get beyond. Usually you'll find a school someplace in my book.
I was thinking of Bruce Springsteen's Glory Days.
Absolutely one of my favorites. When I had my students write poetry in my classroom, I played that song for them often. And I had them come discuss it and then write about it. I also use Richard Cory. I don't know if you're familiar with that, from The Sounds of Silence by Simon and Garfunkel. And Imagine, of course. We all use Imagine. But there is very little difference between a songwriter and a poet. They're writing lyrics. During the Hurricane Dorian, I had to evacuate. I went to Nashville, Tennessee, and I visited the Country Music Hall of Fame for the first time. And I learned that one of my favorite writers, Shel Silverstein, is in the Country Music Hall of Fame. I don't know if you know that or not.
I did not know that.
He wrote Johnny Cash's song, A Boy Named Sue.
Oh, how fun.
Yes, that was Johnny Cash's #1 song, sold more than any others. Shel Silverstein wrote a lot of song lyrics that other people used. And I had no idea that person who wrote those children's stories was a songwriter, and he was inducted into the Country Music Hall of Fame.
My goodness, my goodness. What about rap today? Rap music is very popular, and it is also rhyming. It is also verse. It takes some of the negative lyrics out, but is there a lot of correlation that children, teenagers, like to, is that one of the ways they relate to your poetry?
Yes. I often use some rap music in my classroom, or referred to it if I didn't dare. If there was some kind of a word, I would just say, I'm sure you've heard, and I would maybe use Eminem was basically easier to use. There were a few who I could mention, and I wouldn't worry about getting in trouble. Of course, in New York, it was somewhat liberal, but I was very careful. I don't want to bring profanity into the classroom. I don't believe in that. But rap music almost always has a great couplet, a couple of rhyming lines. And I like to use couplets, and I like a twist in the last two lines, and that's what rap songs do. So we talked about how rap songs are similar to those poems like Dorothy Parker uses, with the last two lines just swoop, change, you're in a different direction now. Oh, that was what this was all about. And as far as I want to get back just a second to why I love the novel in verse. There is a novelist, Madeline Kuderick, who wrote a book about, it's called Kiss of Broken Glass. And she had a daughter who was dealing with a substance issue, and she couldn't reach her daughter until she started to write a book about the experience, and she wrote it in the form of poems. When she turned that to a character instead of her daughter opened up to her. She could use the mask of the character to talk about her feelings. And so these books are great ways for teenagers to talk about what they're feeling, their emotions.
Wow, Melody, this has been a great conversation. How can people get in touch with you?
I have a website. It's www.melodydeandimmick.com, and I have some trailers for some of my books on there, and I talk about my books. I have a blog there. They can go right to my blog. It says Melody's News, but it's my news, and that's where they can contact me. And of course, I'm on Facebook. I'm on Instagram. I wanted to be an Instagram poet. I read about that and decided I would try a few Instagram poems, and I've actually gotten some good results from that. And I did a wonderful, fun project this summer, the August Postcard Poetry Festival. And so I'm also online with the Postcard Festival people.
Oh, that's really interesting. I didn't even realize that there's so many opportunities for poets these days. One more thing is, how can people figure out more information? How can people find more information about the Florida Writers Foundation?
Well, that's a sore subject right now. We had a little crash on our website. But we will have a website up and running soon. So the Florida website, if you go from the Florida Writers Association, you can just click Florida Writers Foundation right now. But we're hoping that we're going to make it possible for everyone to find a link a little bit more easily. So we're working on that. I'm talking about it throughout the conference, and our silent auction is run by the Florida Writers Foundation, so you can ask Tammy Whiting, who's there. And I'll be posting on Facebook. I'll be posting on Instagram. I'll be posting on Twitter and letting people know when our website is up and running with a lot of information. And eventually, we're going to have a flyer to describe who we are and why we are.
Well, thank you so much for that information. Are you ready to switch to our rapid fire questions?
I'm ready.
If a TV movie were made about you, who would star you?
Oh, my favorites are no longer with us. Today, well, I think my favorite is Mariska Hargitay. I like her. She's spunky.
She is spunky. That's a little what's the show called? SVU. It's
Law and Order.
Law and Order SVU. Yes. All right. Do you go to spas?
No.
No.
And not because I don't want to, but I'm a diabetic, so I have to be very careful that everything that I touch is sanitary.
Well, that's interesting. Where do you see yourself in 5 years?
Well, I would love to see myself on the best New York Times bestseller list, or at least at a scholastic book fair. That's really why I started to write. I wanted my books to be in the classroom so that teenagers could reach them. And that makes it difficult to get an agent because those books don't cost as much as hardbacks. And when you say, I really want to have my book in the classroom, I want my students to be able to get my books in the library, it's a little trickier.
That is a little tricky. Again, Melody, thank you so much for stopping by.
Thank you.
There we go. This has been another edition of the Florida Writer Podcast. Allison out.
Melody Dean Dimick is an award-winning poet and author. She is also the president of the Florida Writers Foundation. For more information about the Florida Writers Foundation, visit them on the web at floridawritersfoundation.net. For more information about the Florida Writers Association, visit us at floridawriters.net.